Have you ever noticed how life has a way of slipping through your fingers, no matter how tightly you try to hold on? Moments you wish would last forever, a perfect evening with someone you love, the warmth of a child's laugh, the quiet peace of an early morning, they come, and just as easily they go. And yet we cling. We cling to the illusion that things can stay the same, that the people we love will always be here, that the things we cherish will always be within reach, that the version of ourselves we've grown used to will never fade. But if you listen closely, if you truly pay attention, you'll hear life whispering a truth most of us spend our entire lives trying to avoid. Everything changes. Everything. From the greatest mountains to the tiniest flower, from the brightest star to the beating of your own heart, nothing stays the same. It's a quiet truth, a truth so subtle, so woven into the fabric of reality that we often don't see it until something precious is taken from us. A relationship ends, a loved one passes away, a dream dissolves, and in those moments it feels as though the ground beneath our feet has given way. We ask, why did this have to happen? Why now? Why me? The truth is, it's always been happening. We were simply too distracted, too hopeful, too afraid to notice. There's a story from ancient Buddhist texts about a young woman named Kisagatami. She lost her only child and, overwhelmed by grief, wandered the streets begging for medicine to bring her baby back. A wise elder told her to visit the Buddha, who gently asked her to bring a handful of mustard seeds from a household where no one had ever died. She searched all day, but of course, every door she knocked on had its own story of loss. It was in that moment Kisagatami understood grief is not her burden alone. Loss visits every home. Change is the nature of life itself. We struggle not because life is cruel, but because we refuse to accept this invisible truth. We chase permanence in a world built on impermanence. Modern life only makes this harder. We curate images of stability, smiling family photos, carefully planned futures, promises of forever. We surround ourselves with technology that seems to slow time, capturing memories in photos, archiving them on clouds, replaying old moments as if they could be lived again. But behind this illusion of control, change moves like an unseen current. The seasons shift, bodies age, friendships drift, fashions fade. The world spins and we, like leaves caught in the wind, are carried forward whether we want to be or not. And here's the paradox. The more we resist this truth, the more we suffer. It's not the change itself that breaks us, it's our refusal to let go. We're terrified of the unknown, of what comes after goodbye, of who we become without the things and people we thought defined us. But what if, instead of fighting it, we learn to see change not as an enemy, but as the very nature of life? What if we realize that impermanence isn't a curse, but a hidden grace? That in every ending there's a space, however small, for something new to begin. Imagine for a moment if nothing ever changed. If the world remained frozen, locked in place, untouched by time. There would be no growth, no discovery, no second chances. The painful moments would stretch on endlessly, and the beautiful ones would never arrive. It's the fleeting nature of life that gives it meaning. A cherry blossom's beauty lies in its fragility. A sunset is precious because it disappears. A lover's embrace holds weight because it can't last forever. The Buddha taught that clinging is the root of suffering. We grasp at people, moments, emotions, identities, desperately trying to hold on to what was never meant to stay. And in doing so, we miss the profound beauty of what is. But here's the truth no one tells you. Freedom isn't found in controlling the waves of change, but in learning how to ride them. To witness each moment for what it is, a fleeting, miraculous piece of a larger unfolding. To love without possession, to grieve without drowning, to live without fear. Somewhere deep down, you already know this. You felt it. In that quiet moment before dawn when the world holds its breath. In the ache of a goodbye you didn't want to say. In the joy of a memory you know can never return. Life is not a still painting to be preserved. It's a living river, forever moving, forever becoming. And you are a part of it. So perhaps the question isn't why do things change? The question is, how can we find peace within that change? That's where our journey begins. Not in trying to stop the river, but in learning to swim. And as you'll soon discover once you stop clinging to the rocks, you realize the current was never your enemy. It was carrying you home all along. There's a word in ancient Pali, the language of the Buddha's earliest teachings. A word that carries within it a wisdom so simple, so direct, it can change the way you see the world. That word is anicca. It means impermanence, the ever-shifting, ever-dissolving, ever-becoming nature of all things. The Buddha didn't stumble upon this truth by accident. He saw what most of us spend our lives refusing to look at. That everything we love, everything we fear, every joy and sorrow, every pleasure and pain, it all arises, lingers for a while and eventually fades. Nothing lasts. Not the cherry blossoms in spring, not the warmth of summer, not the strength of youth, not the ache of grief, not even the identity you wear so proudly in this moment. Anicca touches everything. When the Buddha spoke of suffering dukkha, he wasn't just talking about pain or misfortune. He was pointing to a deeper kind of unease, one that comes from clinging to things that, by their very nature, cannot remain as they are. You see, the mistake isn't in loving. It's in believing that what we love will stay unchanged. The house you built, the body you inhabit, the people you hold closest, they will all transform. They will all slip through your grasp. And this isn't a flaw in the system, this is the system. Anicca is not a punishment. It's not a personal betrayal by life. It's the heartbeat of existence. It's what allows life to breathe, to evolve, to move forward. Without it, there would be no birth, no rebirth, no morning after the darkest night. But here's where it gets subtle. The problem isn't impermanence itself. It's our refusal to see it. We build our worlds on the assumption that tomorrow will resemble today, that the people we love will remain as they are, that our circumstances will hold steady. But life, indifferent to our plans, keeps moving. And the more tightly we cling, the sharper the pain when the inevitable arrives. The Buddha compared life to a dewdrop on a blade of grass at dawn. For a moment, it catches the first light of morning, sparkling like a jewel. And then, with the heat of the rising sun, it vanishes. Not because it was flawed, but because that is its nature. Modern life makes it easy to forget this. We drown in constant distraction, endless scrolling, relentless schedules. We chase novelty, mistaking it for permanence, moving from one temporary high to another, refusing to sit still long enough to witness the quiet truth humming beneath it all. But those who dare to pause, to look carefully, discover something astonishing. In seeing the world's impermanence, you don't grow colder, you grow kinder. You hold your loved ones a little closer, knowing their presence is a gift. You forgive a little faster, realizing how quickly lives diverge. You savor a moment's peace, understanding it won't linger. Anicca invites us not to despair, but to wake up. When you realize the world is constantly changing, you stop expecting it to behave in a way that suits your comfort. And in that space of letting go, suffering softens. Even our emotions, which feel so overwhelming in the moment, obey this law. Joy, anger, sorrow, love, they arise, peak, and fade. Nothing stays. No feeling is final. No state of mind permanent. And there's extraordinary freedom in that. The Buddha didn't teach impermanence to frighten us. He taught it because it's the doorway to liberation. If you grasp this truth, not as an idea, but as a lived experience, you loosen the chains that bind you to every passing storm. You begin to see that life isn't about clinging to what was or anxiously reaching for what might be. It's about showing up fully for what is. Right here, right now. A child's laughter, the scent of rain on dry earth, the ache of parting, the thrill of beginning, all of it passing, all of it precious, all of it life. And when you live this way, every moment becomes a kind of miracle, not because it will last, but because it won't. There's an old Zen saying, "The 10,000 things rise and fall while the self watches." It reminds us that behind all this coming and going, there's a deeper stillness, a part of you untouched by time, by loss, by decay. That silent witness within, aware of all things changing yet never diminished. In Buddhism, we don't deny the world's sorrow. We embrace it. We learn to bow to it. And in doing so, we find a joy unshaken by circumstance. Anicca isn't just a teaching. It's the pulse of the universe. It's the reason flowers bloom and wither, why tides rise and fall, why hearts break and heal. And when you start to live in rhythm with this truth, you'll notice something beautiful. You stop fearing endings, because you've seen that in every ending, a new beginning quietly waits. If impermanence is the law of life, then why do we struggle so much to accept it? Why do we cling to what's meant to slip through our fingers? Why do we hold so tightly to people, to memories, to identities, even when it costs us peace? The answer lies deep within the human mind, not in the noise of thought, but in the ancient wiring of our being. We're built to hold on. Evolution taught us that attachment meant survival. The infant clings to the mother. The tribe gathers close for warmth and safety. Food, shelter, love, these things kept us alive. And in a world where danger lurked in every shadow, losing what you needed could mean losing everything. But what once kept us alive now quietly keeps us in chains. Modern life may look safer, but the mind hasn't changed as quickly as the world around it. We still grasp at what feels good, push away what feels bad, and dread the unknown like some ancient predator in the dark. Buddhism calls this craving tanha, a thirst so relentless, it can never be fully satisfied. We thirst for pleasure, for permanence, for control. And because the world cannot offer these things, suffering arises. Psychology describes this in its own language. The mind forms attachments not just to people, but to ideas about how life should be. We cling to narratives. I must always be happy. I can't lose them. This moment should last forever. I'll only be okay when. These beliefs feel invisible like air, but they shape every thought, every reaction, every ache in your chest. And when reality fails to align with the story, as it inevitably does, pain appears. A relationship ends. A job slips away. Youth fades. The body falters. And the mind, so invested in its attachments, rebels. We resist, we bargain, we grieve not only the loss itself, but the loss of our illusion of control. Have you noticed how pain sharpens most when we fight it? A difficult emotion, left alone, rises and passes like a storm. But when we clutch at it, why is this happening? This shouldn't be. The suffering multiplies. It's like grasping a rope that's burning your hands. The tighter you hold, the deeper the pain. The act of clinging is the wound. But here's the paradox. We don't cling because we're weak. We cling because we long for certainty in an uncertain world. And that longing is profoundly human. The Buddha didn't condemn attachment because it was evil. He pointed it out because it was unnecessary. Because every moment we spend grasping at what can't stay is a moment stolen from the life we could be living right now. And it isn't just to possessions or people. We cling to roles, to being the successful one, the good parent, the invincible partner. We become prisoners of our own labels, terrified of what might happen if they're stripped away. But labels decay, beauty fades, fortunes turn, fame is forgotten. What remains when all that falls away is you, the bare, breathing witness behind the mask. This is why Buddhist practice isn't about cold detachment, but about skillful letting go. Not pushing away love or joy, but releasing the need to trap them in place. When you hold a butterfly too tightly, you crush it. But if you let it land, savor its delicate presence and trust it will leave, you experience its beauty fully, without demand. Life is like that. Every moment invites you to choose, grip or release, fear or trust, clinging or opening. And this isn't some abstract philosophy. Science confirms it. Studies show that those who accept life's unpredictability, who learn to sit with discomfort rather than control it, report greater resilience, deeper well-being, even longer-lasting happiness. Not because their lives are easier, but because they've stopped expecting life to behave. The storm still comes, but you stop trying to hold back the rain, and in that surrender, peace is born. This is why great teachers throughout history, from the Buddha beneath the Bodhi tree to modern mindfulness masters, have spoken of surrender, not as defeat, but as wisdom. Surrender doesn't mean giving up. It means giving in to the truth of how things are, and in doing so, finding a strength the world can't take from you. You stop clinging, not because you no longer care, but because you care so much you refuse to strangle life with your demands. When you loosen your grip, love becomes freer, joy becomes lighter, grief becomes cleaner, and every breath, every sunrise, every goodbye carries its own quiet grace. Because you finally see, you were never meant to keep any of it, and so the journey continues. Not away from the world, but deeper into it, eyes open, heart soft, hands unclenched. For it is only in letting go that we truly begin to hold what matters. If clinging is the source of so much of our quiet suffering, how do we begin to release it? How do you loosen your grip when your heart insists on holding tight? How do you unchain yourself from the illusions you've called home? The Buddha didn't leave us in the dark. His wisdom wasn't meant to live in dusty scriptures or be reserved for monastics beneath temple roofs. It was meant for us, for people caught in the push and pull of daily life. For you sitting here, listening in the soft hush of this moment. And it begins, as all transformation does, with awareness. You cannot let go of what you don't see yourself holding. So the first step is to notice. Notice when your chest tightens with fear of loss. When you grip at plans, at outcomes, at people, trying to pin them down like fragile butterflies. Notice the stories you tell yourself about how life should be, how others must behave, how you can't live without this or that. Not to judge yourself, not to shame your craving, but to witness it as the silent, compassionate observer of your own mind. This is what mindfulness truly is, not a trendy practice, but a radical act of seeing things as they are, without distortion, without clinging. And in that awareness, a space opens, a space between the impulse to grasp and your ability to choose. It's in that space that freedom lives. The next step is understanding impermanence not as an abstract idea, but as a living, breathing reality. One practice I often share is this. When you hold something dear, a cup of tea, the warmth of a loved one's hand, the glow of a sunset, silently remind yourself. This too will pass, not to dampen the sweetness, but to savor it more fully, because knowing it won't last makes it all the more precious. Like cherry blossoms that fall too soon, like laughter that echoes in memory, like breath itself. Each moment is a visitor. Welcome it kindly, and when it leaves, bow in gratitude for its brief, beautiful stay. Another powerful practice is to gently loosen your attachment to identity. We don't just cling to things. We cling to who we believe we are, the successful one, the victim, the good parent, the broken heart. These roles feel safe because they tell us how to be, but they also trap us. And when life shifts, as it always does, we suffer, not just the event but the loss of the mask. Practice sitting quietly, closing your eyes and asking, "Who am I if I let this label go?" You might feel a moment of fear, a strange weightlessness, but in that space something sacred stirs, the unnameable self, the one the Buddha called anatta, not fixed, not permanent, but a fluid, ever-changing awareness. This isn't erasing your humanity. It's reclaiming your freedom, and perhaps most importantly, learn the art of presence. Attachment lives in the future and the past, in what we fear to lose, in what we regret we've lost, but rarely in this exact moment. Right now you are here, alive, breathing, held by a world that for all its sharp edges continues to turn. Anchor yourself in what is. Feel the weight of your body, the rise of your breath, the texture of sunlight on your skin. When you catch your mind clinging, bring it back, again and again, not with harshness, but with the tenderness of a parent guiding a child home. This is letting go, not as a grand dramatic act, but as 1,000 quiet choices. To release the past, to soften around the future, to be here now. And remember, letting go doesn't mean loving less. It means loving freely, not with hooks and demands, but with open hands. It means cherishing what you have while you have it, and blessing it on its way when it's time to part. Grief will still come, goodbyes will still ache, but you'll suffer less from your own resistance, and more from the honest tenderness of having loved so well. That too is sacred. The lotus blooms brightest from the deepest mud, and your wisdom will bloom from the places you dare to release your grip. So practice gently, forgive yourself often, and know that every moment you loosen your hold, the world softens its hold on you. And as we move forward, it's time to explore something even more delicate, the fragile beauty of our emotions. Because beneath our attachments lies a web of feelings we often misunderstand. And it's only by understanding them that we can truly begin to live. There's a quiet truth hiding in plain sight, one so simple we overlook it and so profound it could shift the way we move through this world. Nothing exists alone, not a drop of water, not a tree in a forest, not a single breath you draw into your chest. Everything arises because of something else. Everything depends on everything else. This is what Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh beautifully called interbeing. And though the term might sound poetic, it's not philosophy for the bookshelf. It's the very fabric of our lives. Pause for a moment and consider the cup of tea in your hand. Within that simple cup lives a story so vast it spans the entire cosmos. The rain that fell upon the hillside, the soil that cradled the tea leaves, the farmer's gentle hands, the sunlight traveling millions of miles to kiss the leaves awake, the clouds, the earthworms, the distant stars, all dancing their part in the simple act of your drinking. And you are not separate from that story. The Buddha taught that nothing has a fixed, independent existence. What we call a self is a collection of conditions, body, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, all arising, changing, fading. Much like a flame isn't a thing in itself but a process, flickering, fed by fuel, air, and space. And so it is with you. You are your ancestors' blood. You are your mother's laughter, the heartbreak you thought would end you, the kindness of strangers, the winds that shape the landscape you walk upon. We forget this because our minds crave neat boundaries. This is me. That is you. This is mine. That is theirs. But the walls are an illusion. A single heartbeat affects the world in ways too subtle to measure. You smile at a stranger. They carry that warmth into their day. They soften towards someone else. A cycle begins, invisible, unstoppable. And when we cling, when we refuse to let go, it is just ourselves we harm. It's the web, because your suffering ripples out, just as your peace does. One of the most beautiful practices in Buddhism is the contemplation of dependent origination, paticca samuppada. It reveals that everything we experience arises from conditions, and when those conditions cease, so does the experience. Joy blooms not from nowhere, but from kindness, gratitude, presence. Suffering takes root not in isolation, but from ignorance, clinging, and aversion. And so, if we want to transform ourselves, we must tend the garden of causes, not curse the fruit. When you feel loneliness, trace its thread. Perhaps it began in a story you were told about what makes a person worthy. When you feel anger, notice its roots. Perhaps it grew from fear, unmet expectations, or the ache of feeling unseen. Everything is linked. And as you become aware of these interwoven threads, you begin to see you were never truly alone in your pain, nor are you alone in your healing. Interbeing also teaches us that letting go isn't erasure. When something or someone leaves, they don't vanish. They transform. The tree that falls becomes soil. The breath you release nourishes the air. The love that couldn't stay becomes wisdom, softness, the strength you didn't know you had. Nothing truly dies. Everything changes form. And so, to let go isn't to lose. It's to honor the natural flow of life. When we stop clinging, we don't fall into emptiness. We fall into connection. We realize we were never separate to begin with. Your grief, your joy, your mistakes, your courage, all threads in the same vast tapestry, woven by invisible hands, shaped by winds we'll never fully name. You exist because the universe sings you into being, breath by breath. And you, in turn, sing it back. When you understand this, your heart softens toward others. The person who hurt you is also a product of causes and conditions. The stranger you ignore is your distant kin. The earth beneath your feet isn't a resource to be conquered, but a living relative. And suddenly, compassion isn't a virtue you force. It's a natural response. Because how could you harm what you're inseparably a part of? How could you cling to what was never truly yours? How could you hate what, at some level, is also you? This is not philosophy. It's reality. And when you start to live it in quiet moments, in messy conversations, in the choices no one sees, your suffering begins to loosen. The web holds you, and you hold it. And now, as we continue this path together, we turn toward one of the greatest challenges, the mystery of loss and grief. Because if everything is interconnected, why does letting go still ache so deeply? What do we do when impermanence comes for the things we love most? The answers lie in the next chapter. Not as easy comforts, but as gentle truths the heart was born to carry. When we hear about impermanence, it can feel like a distant philosophy, something monks contemplate in quiet monasteries, far from the noise of ordinary life. But the truth is, impermanence isn't a theory to debate. It's the most intimate companion we have. It's the breath we just released, the child who outgrew our arms, the dawn we'll never see again. And though it may sound somber, the Buddha didn't speak of impermanence to sadden us. He spoke of it to set us free. But how do we live it? Not just as an idea, but as a practice woven into our daily moments like threads of gold inside ordinary days. It starts here, in small, ordinary acts. 1. Morning gratitude as a ritual of awareness. Before the world rushes in, before emails, notifications, and to-do lists, take a single moment when you wake up. Place your hand on your chest. Feel your heart beating, unasked. Notice your breath arriving effortless, and whisper to yourself, this too is a new moment. It will never come again. Recognize that even this morning is impermanent. It won't wait for you to notice it. So begin it with gratitude. Not the grand, abstract kind, but for the sun on your window, for the cup of tea in your hand, for the simple fact that you are here. This is not sentimentality. It's training the mind to see reality as it is, precious, fleeting, alive. 2. Let small goodbyes be teachers. Every day is filled with tiny endings. The way your child's laugh sounds at this age, the last bite of your favorite dish, the moment your friend walks away after a conversation. But most of us rush past them. Instead, pause, notice them. When you finish a cup of tea, place it down and silently thank it. When a beautiful song ends, let yourself feel that ache of wanting it to last, then breathe it out. These small goodbyes teach us to soften around endings. They prepare the heart for the bigger farewells life inevitably asks of us. 3. The 5 remembrances. In Buddhist monasteries, monks recite the 5 remembrances daily. Not to be morbid, but to wake up. They go like this: I am of the nature to grow old. I am of the nature to become ill. I am of the nature to die. All that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature to change. My actions are my true belongings. At first, they may seem heavy, but over time, they strip away illusions we cling to, leaving behind a raw, gentle clarity. Recite them softly to yourself each evening. Notice how your attachment to trivial irritations weakens. Notice how your appreciation for the ordinary deepens. Because when you know a thing will leave you, you learn to hold it differently. 4. Practice letting go in little ways. You don't need to wait for great tragedies to practice non-clinging. Let the smaller moments train you. Delete a photo you don't need. Give away an item you once loved but no longer use. Leave a conversation without needing the last word. Notice a beautiful sunset, knowing you can't capture it. Each of these is a chance to loosen your grip, to remember that clinging doesn't stop impermanence. It only creates suffering. As the Zen saying goes, let go or be dragged. 5. Mindful breathing, the ultimate teacher of change. Your breath is the most faithful, immediate teacher of impermanence you'll ever have. No 2 breaths are alike. Each one arrives, lives, and leaves. When you feel anxious, lost, or resistant to change, sit quietly. Follow your breath, in and out. Notice how it comes without effort. And no matter how tightly you hold it, it leaves. Let that be your lesson. You don't control beginnings. You don't prevent endings, but you can meet them with grace. 6. Offer compassion to yourself. Some days the truth of impermanence will feel sharp. A reminder of what you lost. A fear of what you might lose. When that happens, don't force yourself to be stoic. Place a hand on your heart and say, it's okay. Everything changes and I am learning how to stay soft through it. Impermanence isn't meant to harden us. It's meant to break the walls we build, so life can touch us fully in joy and in sorrow. 7. Plant seeds you'll never see bloom. The most powerful way to live impermanence is to act with kindness, knowing you may never see its result. Smile at a stranger, pick up litter from a trail, forgive without fanfare. Say thank you. Write the words that no one asked for. Trust that these small, invisible gestures ripple out in ways you'll never trace. You plant them, life carries them. And long after you're gone, the seeds you scattered will bloom in someone else's heart. That too is immortality. So you see, embracing impermanence isn't a distant goal. It's a way of being in the world breath by breath, letting go of what must pass and savoring what's here. Not as a way to escape pain, but as a path to peace. And now, as we prepare to step into our final chapter together, we arrive at a place of stillness. A wisdom the ancients knew, that by surrendering to impermanence we don't lose life, we finally belong to it. Somewhere along this path, something quietly shifted. Maybe you felt it. Maybe it was so subtle, it slipped between your thoughts like wind moving through leaves. That aching weight we carry, the need to hold on, to control, to make time stop, it began to loosen. And what took its place wasn't emptiness, it was space. a soft, open space where life could finally move as it always meant to. You see, impermanence isn't a thief. It's not here to steal from you. It's the artist behind every sunset. The reason a child's laugh feels like music. The hidden hand that makes every kiss, every song, every kindness matter. Without endings, nothing would shine. Without loss, there'd be no tenderness. Without change, love would be static, lifeless, a museum relic, not a living, breathing thing. The Buddhists call it anicca. We might call it life. And the wise don't run from it. They don't curse the seasons, the wrinkles, the final goodbyes. They learn to live lightly, to hold things with open palms, to savor what comes, release what leaves, to laugh a little louder, cry a little freer, forgive a little sooner, not because nothing matters, but because everything does. If this life is a river, and it is, peace doesn't come by trying to dam it up. It comes by learning to float, to trust the current, to love what passes by, knowing you can't keep it and you don't need to. Because every wave leaves a mark inside you, and every soul you meet, every sorrow you outlast, every joy you let break your heart wide open, they shape you. Not into someone tougher, but someone softer. And that, dear one, is where freedom lives. So maybe tomorrow, when you watch the clouds shift, or hear a song you once loved, or say goodbye to a moment you wish could stay, you'll remember this: impermanence isn't the enemy. It's the pulse of the world, the breath behind every miracle, and the more lightly you live, the more life you feel. The Buddha never promised us a life without sorrow. He promised us a path through it. And along that path, there is a strange and tender kind of joy. A quiet peace in knowing that you don't have to cling so tightly, that you can love, lose, grieve, celebrate, and keep walking, that you can watch the leaves fall and know that spring in some form always returns, that you, in all your flawed, aching, radiant humanity, are part of something vast and holy and endlessly changing. So breathe in. Notice this moment, it's already leaving, and let it go. Because in the letting go, you finally belong. Thank you for walking this path with me. May you live lightly, love fiercely, and find peace in the ever-changing dance of life.